Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our next presidential series installment, taking a look at the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon. Of course, I am flying solo, as you guys know, this week for the video and audio portions. Henry is on vacation, so I am doing Nixon by myself. So, Part 1, of course, we went over the birthplace, the youth, the education, the rise in the political ranks of Richard Nixon. And now we're going to get into, of course, in Part 2, the presidency, the legacy, and then the death. And yes, the burial and gravesite of Richard Nixon. But again, keep in mind, I have never actually visited the gravesite of Richard Nixon. It's out in California, and I have not yet gone and seen those. There's only 2 I haven't seen, and it's both of our presidents in California, and Nixon happens to be one of them. But I am still going to show you the gravesite. There's plenty of stock photos. There's photos that friends of mine who have visited there have sent me. So I have plenty of photos of the grave to show you. They're just not not my own photos. But we do have plenty of good bonus footage and fun stuff coming up for you in this part. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to, of course, first take a look at the election like I always do. I always like to kind of just show you guys what happened when somebody got elected. So it was the 1968 presidential election. Richard Nixon was the Republican. The Democrat was Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. And there wasn't actually an independent candidate from Alabama, George Wallace. And Nixon won, pretty handily. Nixon, the electoral vote was 301 for Nixon, 191 to Hubert Humphrey, and 46 to George Wallace. States carried 32 for Nixon, 13 plus Washington, D.C. for Hubert Humphrey, and 5 for George Wallace. It was 43.4% of the popular vote to 42.7% for Humphrey. So it wasn't a big margin of victory, but he did win, of course. His running mate, the vice presidential running mate for Nixon, was Spiro Agnew. He was the governor of Maryland. Spiro Agnew was. So he was on the ticket with Nixon. And, so there you go. That's what got Nixon elected, and he became the 37th President of the United States of America in that 1968 presidential election. So there's that. I'm sure you've seen some maps and photos and election campaign posters and all that good stuff that I usually show. So here we go. Now moving on, we're going to just jump right in to the presidency and an overview of Nixon's presidency and legacy. Here we go. While the Democrats were battling it out amongst themselves, a Republican phoenix was rising. Richard Nixon, who had narrowly lost the race to John F. Kennedy 8 years earlier, saw an opportunity. He promised to bring an honorable end to Vietnam and restore order for the silent majority. There was clearly a segment of the American public that during the 1960s resented the activism of young radicals who felt that in their own quiet way, they were working hard trying to do their bit for America. And it was Nixon's insight to appeal to this group and to say, "You are the ones in whose name I will be governing." This time, Nixon won a close election, edging out Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to become the 37th President of the United States. It is important to understand how deeply divided the nation was in 1969 when Richard Nixon became president. He had to deal with massive Democratic majorities. We were as divided in 1969 as we had been since the days of the Civil War. Richard Nixon ushers in a 40-year period of conservative dominance in American political culture, and yet Richard Nixon himself can be seen as the last of the New Deal presidents. Richard Nixon gave us OSHA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Richard Nixon indexed Social Security and other program benefits. Richard Nixon signed off on the constitutional amendment giving 18-year-olds the vote. Well, Nixon was a conservative at heart, but he was more than that. He was a pragmatist. The public was still quite demanding of government activism to address problems, and Nixon understood this. So he was quite willing to let the Democrats in Congress drive his legislative agenda. Nixon's greater interest was in foreign policy, where he believed he could forge his legacy. Nixon wanted to be Woodrow Wilson. He wanted to be a great statesman. He wanted to enhance the position of the United States in the world, and he believed fervently that it was his foreign policy that made great presidents. Richard Nixon came to office trying to defuse the anti-war movement, and he did it through his policy of Vietnamization. It did away with the draft. There were fewer troops in Vietnam, but at the same time, he never gave up on the goal of winning the war. But he was going to win the war simply by bombing the hell out of them. Nixon believed he had a chance to make a bigger mark in the Cold War by secretly preparing to open diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. He hoped that new ties between the U.S. and the Chinese might pressure North Vietnam to agree to a settlement. Excuse me. The two great communist powers, the Soviet Union and China, actually did not get along very well. So he developed a policy of triangulation, which he did, is he played them off against each other, and it worked pretty brilliantly. Nixon changed American policy toward China, and as a consequence, he changed the structure of international relations from that point until the present. The United States and China have gone from being diametrically opposed enemies to partners in economic affairs, and the world economy would be entirely different today if not for Nixon's opening to China. Nixon continued keeping foreign affairs presidential turf, carving out a sphere of influence insulated from the reach of Congress and dominated by his loyal inner circle. For any foreign policy moves, he relied primarily on one man, Henry Kissinger. So much so that the two of them were often referred to as Nixonger. Nixon was convinced that the State Department was filled with Ivy Leaguers, with Democrats, with people who were out to undermine him. And so the idea that he had was to bypass the State Department as much as possible to orient foreign policy exclusively through the White House, to bypass any meaningful oversight. And he believes that Congress, and this is, a very common view among presidents, especially after they become president, that Congress is petty, that Congress is enthralled to all these special interests, that only the president kind of sees the country's good. As the election of 1972 approached, Richard Nixon was flying high. Troop levels in Vietnam had dropped to under 100,000, down from the peak of more than 500,000 under Johnson. The nightly news showed the president shaking hands with Cold War rivals in China and the USSR. Nixon routed his opponent, Democrat George McGovern, taking 49 out of 50 states, outdoing the historic landslide victories of FDR and LBJ, a feat repeated only by Ronald Reagan in 1984. But Nixon's triumph would soon be overshadowed. Nixon came into the White House as something of a paranoid personality to begin with. He was always suspicious of enemies. Nixon is exactly the wrong man for the job in this respect. He comes in saying he wants to heal America, but in fact, he is actively engaged in polarizing. When Richard Nixon used his political operatives to spy on the Democratic Party to try to get an edge on George McGovern in 1972, Nixon, I am sure, told himself that if the president has to bend the law a little bit in the service of the higher good, this is what a president sometimes must do. What became known as the Watergate Scandal, named after the building where the campaign office was burglarized, revealed additional abuses of power on Nixon's part. He authorized wiretaps on citizens, he approved payments to cover up the scandal, and he misused the CIA to divert an FBI investigation. Nixon, however, appeared unfazed. He saw the president as kind of a justifiably all-powerful figure. In his interviews with David Frost after he leaves office, he has this famous line, "When the president does it, that means it is not illegal."
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
Congress did not agree, and for only the second time in history, they moved towards impeaching a president. As a special prosecutor gathered evidence against him, Nixon dug in, refusing to turn over taped recordings of his conversations in the Oval Office. The struggle over the prosecutor's tapes brings the three branches of government into conflict. You have Congress, which is demanding information. You have the Nixon White House, which is withholding it, and they turn to the Supreme Court to ultimately decide. And the Supreme Court decided 8-0, unanimously, that Richard Nixon must turn over the tapes. And it is those tapes that expose Nixon's guilt and lead to the end of his presidency. Rather than face a trial on August 9th of 1974, Richard Milhous Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. I think with some presidents, the office brings out what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. With Richard Nixon, unfortunately, it brought out the lesser or bad angel of his nature. You know, he was like any other person. He was a mixture of good and bad. But there was something about the stresses of the office that brought out the bad Nixon. And they obscured some of the truly important things that he did.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour.
This is the south side of the White House, the side that faces the Washington Monument, Turning Basin, and the Lincoln Memorial. They are emerging from the so-called diplomatic entrance downstairs.
There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford.
Vice President Ford this morning, as he left his home to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
President Nixon peering out from behind the bullet-resistant glass of Vice President and Mrs. Ford, standing just to the left of Mr. and Mrs. Cox, and just in front of that old magnolia tree that was planted by Andrew Jackson. President Nixon's helicopter going over the fountains of the White House South Lawn, over the back black fence, high over the ellipse. Toward the base of the Washington Monument.
And President Dan is getting his last look now as he peers back from that seat in the helicopter.
What a scene
of the
there
White
was.
House as President of the United States. This will be the last look. By the time he comes back to this point, if indeed history decrees that he does at any point, he will, of course, no longer be the president.
And that was the end of Richard Nixon's presidency. Only president to ever resign, as we just said. It's a shame, really, because, you know, for somebody that won such a huge landslide election, it just did not go well and did not end well for Richard Nixon, as we know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you real quick and show you about the 1972 presidential election. That was when Nixon got reelected. Excuse me. So it was Richard Nixon going up with his running mate Spiro Agnew, going up against George McGovern, the Democrat from South Dakota. His running mate was Sergeant Shriver. And Nixon, destroyed him. The electoral vote was 520 to 17. States carried were 49 to 1. And the popular vote was 60.7% to 37.5%. That is how, talk about absurd. This was unbelievable. This was the biggest landslide victory ever. The only one to even come close to that, obviously, or match it was Reagan in 1984. As you're seeing from maps I'm showing you here on the screen and, campaign posters and that sort of thing, it was just, it was ridiculous. He destroyed George McGovern. It was not even close, and he was reelected. So that was in 1972. Now, what I'll do is I'll read you a couple fun facts before I get into some of the other real big stuff about Watergate and that sort of thing with Nixon. So give me 1 second here. Gather my notes. So this is kind of cool. Nixon and Franklin Roosevelt are the only two people to appear on a national presidential ticket 5 times. Nixon won election in 4 of the 5 races, as did FDR. Nixon was the winning vice presidential candidate in 1952 and 1956, and he won the 1968 and 1972 presidential elections. Roosevelt won 4 presidential elections and lost as a vice presidential candidate in 1920. So I thought that was pretty cool. Little fact. It's a fun little presidential trivia thing that I'm sure nobody would ever know. Nixon actually used the comedy show Laugh-In to get elected. At least that is what Nixon reportedly said after he did a cameo appearance on the show just weeks before the 1968 election. Hubert Humphrey refused to do a similar appearance on the show. There you go. Richard Nixon was the first president to visit a nation not recognized by our own government. Nixon's trip to China in 1972 was unique since the United States recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of mainland China. I never knew that. Definitely something I learned because I had no clue about that. I thought this was interesting. I had never heard this. And me being a pretty big JFK buff and assassination buff, I'm surprised I never heard this. Lee Harvey Oswald may have plotted to assassinate Nixon. In the early morning of November 22nd of 1963, Richard Nixon rode through Dallas to the airport to fly home after attending a Pepsi-Cola board meeting. Nixon saw the preparations for the motorcade that hours later would carry John F. Kennedy, the man who defeated him for the presidency 3 years prior, on the streets of the city's downtown. After Nixon landed in New York, he had learned that Kennedy had been gunned down in that motorcade. And in a further coincidence, the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald testified to the Warren Commission that in April of 1963, the alleged assassin read a local newspaper report, tucked a pistol in his belt, and told her, "Nixon is coming. I want to go and have a look." After locking him in a bathroom, Oswald's wife convinced him to turn over his gun. The account was puzzling since Nixon was not in Dallas in April of 1963, and no newspaper mentioned any visit. Pretty interesting stuff. Never knew that. That is something I definitely did not know. President Nixon was actually an avid bowler. One of Nixon's favorite pastimes in the White House was bowling. He'd even bowl a few frames dressed in a suit. In addition to using the alley in the adjacent old executive office building, Nixon had another one-lane alley built in the basement beneath the north portico entrance to the White House. Pretty cool stuff. I didn't know that. Another thing I had no idea about. Let me see some interesting stories here that I could tell you. We know that about him learning nice. Oh, Nixon is known in respected literary circles as the greatest presidential poet. Well, was there not a certain cadence to the phrase, "I'm not a crook"? Not really, but give the free verse poetry of Richard Nixon a gander. He didn't exactly set out to become a poet, but Jack S. Margulies lifted the verses from reflective stream of consciousness moments in the Watergate tapes. They were published in a paperback collection in 1974. The minimalist song-like verse of this fan-favorite history villain is actually sensitive and poignant. As you lose yourself in his meditations on mortality and the precariousness of his emotional disclosure, you'd swear he wasn't the same guy who blurted out, "Sure, Aristotle was a homo. We all know that. So was Socrates," in those same tapes. The collection was well received at the time, and as recently as 2014, there was an Amazon reviewer that called the poems the essence of the man's angst and gave the collection 5 stars. Pretty cool. Didn't know that. Tricky Dick used the Red Scare to climb to power. Without the little nugget of history known as the Red Scare, the world at large may never have known the name Richard Milhous Nixon. In November of 1946, Nixon was just a nobody law school grad with a couple of years in the Navy under his belt. Nixon found himself back in his California hometown, unsure of what to do next, when a group of Whittier Republicans approached him, convinced him he had the spunk to run for Congress. We already know that. And it earned him, obviously, that campaign, we know, earned him the lifelong nickname of Tricky Dick. Pretty cool stuff there. Here we go. Richard Nixon became the first president to visit all 50 states, but refused to shake hands with anybody from San Francisco. There was a lot of cute little pictures of Richard Nixon checking out San Francisco's space-age monorail BART in 1972. Nixon's visit to San Francisco was a symbol of his initiative to make public transportation a top domestic priority after his signing of the Urban Mass Transportation Assistance Act of 1970. A Californian himself, Nixon was actually the first president to visit all 50 states. However, Nixon did his best to avoid the liberal coastal city only a few hours north of where he grew up. Considering the smiling pictures of Nixon on BART, you'd never guess what he said about San Francisco on the tapes in 1971. "It is the most faggy goddamn thing you could ever imagine. The San Francisco crowd that goes in there, it's just terrible. I mean, I won't shake hands with anybody from San Francisco." Oh boy, not good. Elvis once wrote Nixon a 6-page fanboy letter. Now that the presidents are reality TV stars, appear on niche interview segments like Between Two Ferns and paint canine portraits, the idea of a rock star and a president crossing paths is hardly a twist. But back in December of 1970, the fact that Elvis just showed up in front of the White House at dawn with a poorly written fan letter and was let in to meet with President Nixon was bananas. Nixon was primarily flirting with the geriatric crowd at the time, so he desperately wanted to appear groovy to the youths. A quick snapshot with a pill-popping rock and roller ought to do it. Elvis gushed like a child, requesting Nixon to dub him an honorary federal agent at large, and pretty please give him a badge. Elvis collected badges. Nixon was able to obtain a badge for him, and Elvis gave the reserved politician a big old Tennessee hug. Pretty cool. And I'm going to read you something else about that too here in a minute. Nixon's daughter actually married Eisenhower's grandson. Amid the drama of Nixon's multi-decade political saga, a quiet love story unfolded in the background. In his time as Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon's children visited the White House with him more than any other VPs before him. This was partially due to the fact that Nixon's kids were the right age to make great playmates for Eisenhower's grandkids. Julie Nixon and David Eisenhower were both 8 in 1956 when they met on the campaign trail at the Republican National Convention. Check out the adorable snapshot of the two tykes looking at each other, actually right here. Take a look at that. I think that's a great picture. The two were actually reconnected in 1967 as college students and began dating at 19. And this shiny all-American couple weathered the Nixon fallout and remained married, raising 3 kids. I thought that was pretty cool. Didn't know that. Richard Nixon's first lady was no silent partner. Begin your examination of Pat Nixon with a very loaded quote from one of her USC professors. She stood out from the empty-headed, overdressed little sorority girls of that era like a good piece of literature on a shelf of cheap paperbacks. There isn't a time to unpack all that, but Pat was indeed an intellectual match for her husband and managed to maintain a level of popularity he never could. Pat grew up middle class in Artesia, California, and put herself through college doing rad jobs like being a floor sweeper, a typist, and a driver. She would even go on to win Outstanding Homemaker of the Year in 1953. During her husband's presidency, she encouraged women to get involved in politics. She shook hands with lepers and was the first Republican First Lady to make an address at the Republican National Convention. When she died of cancer in June of 1993, Richard Nixon was seen sobbing in public. He followed her in death 9 months later. This was interesting. Nixon started the war on drugs. Long before the just say no of the Reagan era, there was that time that Nixon casually began the war on drugs to target the voter demographics that threatened his 1968 re-election. These groups were young, white anti-war protesters and African Americans. In April of 2016, Harper's published an article in which the author Dan Baum revisited his notes from a 1994 interview he conducted with Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman. This Ehrlichman quote speaks for itself. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Nixon's tapes revealed his prejudice towards people of color, the queer community, as well as the Irish and Jewish communities. But it was this use of racial and anti-war tensions for a personal political victory that had the farthest-reaching social ramifications. The war on drugs is perhaps the most successful political tool of the past century, as it was employed by many politicians after Nixon. The costs, however, have been devastating to the communities the policies targeted, and mass incarceration remains a top contemporary issue that does not seem to be on the decline. So there you go. There, not very good of good old Tricky Dick. What else can I tell you here? So we already went over this checkers. Oh, here we go. Richard Nixon literally made the mornings darker. In 1973, to save fuel during an energy crisis, Nixon signed a law that mandated that daylight savings would be in effect year-round starting on January 6th of 1974. But kids wound up waiting for their school buses in pitch-black conditions, and there was a fear that they might get hit by traffic. So the idea was scrapped in 1975. As I had already touched on, Richard Nixon had a bowling alley installed under the White House. Nixon, an avid bowler, was pleased to see that the love of bowling that inspired Harry Truman to build lanes in the White House in 1947 was still going strong when he took office in 1969. That alley was moved in 1955, and Nixon actually ordered that a new lane be built underground under the north portico entrance and favored the new location because it was more private than the lanes that were open to other staffers. Nixon reportedly bowled a respectable .232. Richard Nixon wanted the Secret Service to wear uniforms. The president's secretary detail is usually dressed for business. Suits, ties, and sunglasses are the normal attire for many agents, while those patrolling the White House grounds wear police-style uniforms. When Nixon took office, however, he wanted his men to resemble the palace guards he had seen in other countries. The service assigned to his personal detail wore white double-breasted tunics and hats that vaguely resembled the Empire's underlings in a Star Wars film. After he was criticized by the press, Nixon abandoned the idea, and the outfits were eventually donated to a high school marching band. Pretty cool. Richard Nixon almost messed up Charles Manson's murder trial. Nixon's first year in office coincided with the national obsession over cult leader Charles Manson and his followers, some of whom had gone on a murder spree in 1969 that left actress Sharon Tate and several others dead. During Manson's trial in August of 1970, Nixon proclaimed Manson was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason. Manson's lawyers moved for a mistrial based on Nixon's comments. The president quickly retracted his statement, with a spokesperson suggesting he neglected to include the word allegedly. There you go. Richard Nixon met RoboCop. In 1987, Nixon attended a national board meeting for the Boys Club of America. Also on hand to feat organizers and kids was a guy dressed as RoboCop. The unknown actor was definitely not Peter Weller, star of the 1987 feature, and the ill-fitting costume was definitely not the original. For years, an image of the meeting circulated on the internet without context before a crack sleuth determined it had been snapped for Billboard magazine. And of course, Richard Nixon's meeting with Elvis Presley made National Archives history. On December 21st of 1970, Nixon greeted one of the more colorful characters to ever enter the White House, Elvis Presley. The singer apparently wanted a badge or other token of law enforcement, as the king was high on fighting the war on drugs at the time. Unfortunately, Presley had drug issues of his own that may have contributed to his death in 1977. A photo of the meeting between the two is the most requested image in the National Archives, outpacing requests for the moon landing, the Declaration of Independence, or the Bill of Rights. Imagine that. Unreal. So there you have that. One thing I did want to touch on, and I think it would be ignorant of me not to touch on this regarding Richard Nixon's presidency, is the tragic event of May 4th of 1970. On May 4th of 1970, for any of you that do not know, was when 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio were gunned down. And I just want to read a little bit about Richard Nixon's reaction to Kent State. Of course, there's a very famous song by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young called Ohio. Tin Soldiers and Nixon's Coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. So, here we go. Richard Nixon could not sleep. 4 days after the Kent State shootings, the president sat in the sitting room off the Lincoln bedroom listening to a concerto on his record player. With dawn still 2 hours away, Nixon gazed into the darkness where protesters were already gathering around the Washington Monument. The massive demonstration against the Vietnam War and the bloodshed at Kent State planned for later in the day had turned the White House into a fortress. 2 rings of city buses parked bumper to bumper encircled the mansion, and the 82nd Airborne was stationed in the adjacent Executive Office building. Already on high alert, a Secret Service agent was startled when he noticed the shadowy figure in a jacket and tie wandering outside the White House at 4:35 a.m. "Searchlight is on the lawn," he radioed, using Nixon's code name. The agent grew even more alarmed when the president asked for his limousine and departed the White House in order to talk to the anti-war protesters. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in presidential history, one emblematic of an increasingly erratic president leading a country on edge. After Nixon awoke from a nap on May 4th of 1970, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman told the president the stunning news that the Ohio National Guard had opened fire on an anti-war demonstration at Kent State University, leaving 4 students dead and 9 injured. Nixon's April 30th announcement of the American invasion of Cambodia to target suspected North Vietnamese havens had roiled college campuses across the country. The anger grew even further the following day when the president was caught on tape on a visit to the Pentagon calling the protesters bums blowing up campuses. Haldeman wrote in his journal that Nixon was very disturbed by the Kent State shootings, but he noted that the president was mainly preoccupied by the incident's political ramifications. Nixon had long sought to crush the anti-war movement on college campuses, which he believed was the work of outside agitators, and Haldeman reported the president was hoping rioters had provoked the shooting. As student strikes spread across the country and tension mounted, Richard Nixon faced the most important press conference of his presidency on the night of May 8th of 1970. According to Haldeman, advisors feared the president would either be too belligerent and non-understanding of the dissenters or would be too forgiving and thus lose strength in presidential leadership. To many, Nixon struck the right tone. Haldeman wrote the whole press conference was masterful. The president agreed. Deep into the night, Nixon made 50 phone calls, talking to everybody from National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Reverend Billy Graham. He's just completely wired. He thinks he's done a great job and that he knocked it out of the ballpark. Unable to sleep, Nixon summoned his valet and made his nocturnal escape from the White House and directed his limousine to the Lincoln Memorial. The students gathered at the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial may have thought that they were dreaming when they saw the buttoned-up man they had come to the Capitol to protest scale the memorial steps and engage them in conversation. Nixon later said his goal was to lift them a bit out of the miserable intellectual wasteland in which they now wander aimlessly around, along with sprinkling in awkward small talk on topics ranging from the virtues of visiting the Siberian city of Novosibirsk to the Syracuse University football team. The president told the anti-war activists that his ultimate goal wasn't to enter Cambodia, but leave Vietnam. I know that most of you think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel, he said. Nixon spent nearly an hour talking to the students before visiting the U.S. Capitol and having breakfast at the Mayflower Hotel in what Haldeman called the weirdest day so far. So yeah, very strange. Not good. And another thing I want to touch on about the Kent State shootings. On the May 4th of 1970 Kent State massacre, there was a father, Arthur S. Krause. He wrote this to Richard M. Nixon, and it was published in the New York Times on May 7th of 1978. A memo to Mr. Nixon. His daughter, just to preface this, Allison Krause, was one of the girls that was killed in the Kent State shootings. A memo to Mr. Nixon. In the published extracts from your memoirs, you blame the news media for misinterpreting your categorization of student demonstrators as bums. Your remark was made just a few days before my daughter Allison was killed at Kent State University on May 4th of 1970, and you say you were stunned to learn of her death, and that of the other students shot by Ohio National Guardsmen. You claim that the days after the killings were among the darkest of your presidency, and that you were utterly dejected when you read that I had said my daughter was not a bum. So you can also read that excerpt, but that is a very famous moment. Of course, Nixon, said that all these kids were bums trying to basically, ransack college campuses and protest. And then a few days later, Kent State happens, and this man's, Arthur Krause's daughter, Allison, was killed in the Kent State shootings. And he very famously said, my daughter was not a bum. And Richard Nixon was very, apparently taken very back by that. And it's something that bothered him for a very long time. So, what else can I tell you here about Nixon? Before I read a little bit about, of course, maybe a little bit about Watergate. Okay. So, Watergate Scandal. While Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, operatives associated with his campaign broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Several members of Nixon's administration had knowledge of the burglary, and while Nixon denied any involvement, secret tapes of White House conversations later revealed that the president had participated in efforts to cover up the criminal activity. Facing impeachment, he, of course, resigned. And just to read you a little bit about the Watergate scandal, they basically were listening in to Democrat officials trying to get word on things. And really cool thing is, I'm going to show you not only the Watergate Hotel, which still stands, I'm going to show you the room where those political operatives that Nixon basically, told to go get information. I'm going to show you the room, aka the scandal room, inside the Watergate. I actually was given a private tour of the scandal room recently. So I'm going to show you. Now listen, they did not stay in that room. They did not sleep there. They did not stay there. That is just where they convened and basically did all of their, comings and goings from this room. That's where they were able to have a high-powered microphone that was able to listen across the way at the DNC offices and listen to conversations going on by Democratic officials and such. So I'm going to show you the inside of the scandal room. Really cool. What a pleasure to be able to go in there and be exactly where those men were when all this took place. So very cool stuff. I'm going to show you that, not right now. That'll be in the bonus footage, but stay tuned for that. Also, I wanted to touch on, I'm sure as you guys saw, you were looking at pictures as I was talking about Kent State. I did actually visit Kent State University. I did see the little memorial and everything and where the shootings took place. So that's what you were seeing on your screen when I was talking a lot about Kent State. Those were my pictures of my visit to Kent State. So just wanted to touch on that as well. So now it is time, of course, to read from The President is Dead by Louis Picone. Of course, I read from this book every week regarding the deaths of the presidents. So I'm going to read from The President is Dead about Richard Milhous Nixon's death. So here we go. By 1994, it had been 21 years since the death of Lyndon Johnson. Not since the 26-year period between George Washington's death and Thomas Jefferson's had there been a longer stretch when no presidents had died. From 1973 until 1994, living former presidents accumulated until Nixon became one of a record-tying 5 living former presidents, along with George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and Gerald Ford, giving Bill Clinton a larger pool of peer counsel than any other president since Abraham Lincoln. In 1974, Nixon went into shock during surgery to remove blood clots from his leg. His recovery was in doubt, and he teetered dangerously close to death. Fortunately, he survived an additional 2 decades, during which his diplomatic efforts and presidential counsel restored a modicum of his reputation after it had become so tarnished by the Watergate scandal and his actions surrounding it. On the evening of Monday, April 18th of 1994, Nixon was working on the gallery proofs for his latest book on foreign affairs at his condominium in the exclusive Bear's Nest complex in Park Ridge, New Jersey. He suddenly went into distress. His housekeeper, Heidi Retter, eased him onto a couch and called an ambulance. Medics took him to New York Hospital, Cornell Medical Center in Manhattan. Nixon had suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed on his right side and unable to speak, but he was awake and able to give his doctors his signature thumbs up. The next day, his condition improved enough to move him out of intensive care to a private room, but only 2 hours later, he showed signs of cerebral edema, or swelling of the brain. Doctors discovered that a blood clot had moved from his heart to his brain. Under normal circumstances, they would have used a respirator to speed up his breathing to relieve the swelling. But Nixon had made a living will with instructions not to be put on life support to artificially extend his life. On Thursday, April 21st, he slipped into a coma. The next day, on April 22nd of 1994, Richard Milhous Nixon died at 9:08 p.m. with his daughters Julie Nixon Eisenhower and Tricia Cox by his side. President Bill Clinton made an announcement in the White House Rose Garden, while on different sides of the ideological spectrum, Clinton had welcomed Nixon's counsel and praised him as a statesman who sought to build a lasting structure of peace. He declared most federal agencies and American stock exchanges to be closed on the day of the funeral. Former President Reagan also released a statement echoing Clinton's sentiment. Today, the world mourns the loss of a great champion of democratic ideals who dedicated his life to the cause of world peace. On the night of his death, Richard Nixon's body was brought to Vander Platt Funeral Home at 257 Godwin Avenue in Wyckoff, New Jersey. He was dressed in a blue suit and placed in a Marcellus 710 mahogany casket. This model coffin was also known as the President, was the same one as the one that John F. Kennedy was buried in 3 decades earlier. So, of course, he was transported to Washington. There was obviously, viewing and a funeral and such. And then the viewing actually ended. It lasted about 20 hours until about Wednesday, April 27th. And then he was taken obviously out to California. And California is where he's buried. Richard and Pat Nixon's graves are on the grounds of the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. That is actually his home. And Nixon actually holds the distinction, so everybody knows, he holds the distinction of being buried in the closest proximity to his actual birthplace home. It's literally right in the backyard of his birthplace home is where he's buried. So he actually holds that distinction of being buried closest in proximity to his birthplace. The engraving on his, his tombstone there is a really great one. It says, Richard Nixon, 1913 to 1994, the greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. That is actually a Richard Nixon quote, and it's there on his tombstone in Yorba Linda, California, at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum and birthplace. So there's that. Now, the death sites, the location of his death, he did die it's actually New York Presbyterian Will Cornell Medical Center. It's located at 525 East 68th Street in New York City, New York, in Manhattan. So that's where Nixon died, in New York Presbyterian Hospital. His funeral, obviously, let me just read here for you guys. Obviously, we know he was buried. He was born in the home at 9:35 p.m. on January 9th of 1913, and he spent his boyhood years there until his family moved to Whittier. And decision had been made for him to be placed in that backyard, of course. So like I said, in closest proximity to actually where he was born, the birthplace and his childhood home. The grave is actually located at 18001 Yorba Linda Boulevard in Yorba Linda, California. It's on the grounds of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and birthplace. Obviously, I have not gotten out there yet. I hope to. I do hope to, but I have not gotten out there yet. Those are the two I have not seen, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both out in California. But the pictures you're seeing of the grave site, those are stock photos I found online, not my photos. However, I do have some bonus footage to show you surrounding his death. Such as the Bear's Nest complex in Park Ridge where he lived, where he was taken by ambulance to the hospital in New York, and also the funeral home in Wyckoff, New Jersey, the Vander Platt Funeral Home that prepared Richard Nixon's body for his funeral. So stay tuned for that, because you will see quite a lot of bonus footage here. You guys already have seen my Kent State University photos. You're also going to now see in bonus footage after this, you're going to see the Watergate photos. You're going to see the funeral home and his home in New Jersey photos. And you might even see some extra little bonus stuff too. So stay tuned for that. But I hope you enjoyed this. This was a look at the life, legacy, death, presidency, everything of our 37th president of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon, the man who so famously resigned the office of presidency and so famously quoted and said, "I'm not a crook." But unfortunately, Tricky Dick was playing us all for fools. So,
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned, of course. Next week, we're going to take a look at the man who took over after President Nixon resigned, the 38th president of the United States, Gerald Ford. So stay tuned for that. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you, as always, for everything, the support, the comments and questions, the subscribes, everything. You guys are awesome. Please keep those comments and questions coming. I love those. We love the interaction with our subscribers. You guys are great. So thanks again, and stay tuned for the bonus footage, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye, guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ with Dead History. And that right behind me is actually a very cool Richard Nixon significant location. I'm going to turn you guys around. So I'm actually in the parking garage, as you see here. And that right there, spot 32, this is where Bob Woodward met with Mark Deep Throat Felt during their private meetings. As you see here, the Deep Throat parking garage. So pretty interesting stuff. So yeah, right here is where Bob Woodward and Deep Throat Mark Felt met. During the whole, of course, the outset of the Watergate Scandal that obviously inevitably ruined Richard Nixon and his presidency. So this is where it all took place. Now, this parking garage was actually slated to be destroyed. We're in 2021. I think it was actually voted on and slated to be destroyed in like 2015 was the vote. And I think it was scheduled to be destroyed and demolished in 2017 or 2018, and it still stands. So fortunately for me and for you Dead History fans, we're able to still take a look and be here, which is really, really cool. So right here, spot 32 in this parking garage. Again, this is where Bob Woodward met with Mark Felt, better known as Deep Throat. And then even say 6 late-night covert meetings took place in 1972 and 1973 between Washington Post investigative reporter Bob Woodward and Deputy Director of the FBI Mark Felt. He was known to everyone as Deep Throat. The men met in parking space D32, which sits beneath the Oak Hill office building in Roslyn, Virginia. And that is right here. So there you go. Pretty cool stuff. Thanks for joining, guys.
The U.S. ping pong team met with President Nixon today at an Oval
And
Office
wouldn't you know
ceremony.
it, a few months later, they invited me and the ping pong team to visit the White House. So I went again, and I met the President of the United States again. Only this time, they didn't get us rooms in a real fancy hotel.
So are you enjoying yourself in our nation's capital, young man? Yes, sir. Well, where are you staying? It's called the Hotel Ebbot. Oh, no. I know of a much nicer hotel. It's brand new, very modern. I'll have my people take care of it for you.
Security, Frank Wells.
Yeah, sir. You might want to send a maintenance man over to that office across the way. The lights are off and they must be looking for a fuse box or something, because them flashlights, they're keeping me awake.
Okay, sir, I'll check it out.
Thank you.
No problem.
Good night.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. As I recall the high hopes for America, which we began in the second term.
Sergeant Gump,
Yes, sir!
as you were. I have your discharge papers. Service is up, son.
Does this mean I can't play ping pong no more?
For the Army, it does.
And just like that, my service in the United States Army was over. So I went home.
Hey guys, TJ here, Dead History, and inside of a room at Watergate. It's not the scandal room anymore, but I am inside of a room, obviously all behind me. This is Watergate Hotel, yes, where everything famously went down with Nixon. So, pretty cool stuff. To be inside that scandal room was quite amazing, quite a treat. So it was a lot of fun. I actually don't know. I've seen several things on Nixon before, but I haven't seen too many people actually go inside the scandal room. So hopefully that's a bit unique to this video. So thanks for watching. Thanks for joining. And leave those comments below. If I can answer any questions, I'll be happy to try to do so. Thanks, guys. Hey guys, TJ with Dead History, and I am actually in the lobby of the Watergate Hotel here in Washington, D.C. I am actually going to take you guys to the room. Yes, the actual room that it took place at here in Watergate. So I'm hoping that they're going to allow me to film a little bit in that room, but if not, I will take pictures. but I wanted to show you the lobby at least here. So, yes, that's where I'm at. Watergate Hotel. Hopefully I'll be checking back in soon. Thanks.
If you saw like our more standard like balcony rooms, it's exactly the same setup, just going forward.
Wow.
And that's why this room was so like iconic, because it's all the same.
Yeah.
As like our more standard rooms, and so that's why no one was like, oh, like maybe these guys, like these very important guys, these burglars should be staying in like the presidential suite. They should be staying here. I mean, these are gentlemen working with the President of the United States.
Yeah.
But this is the room that they chose, and because of this, they got away with it for so long.
Wow. That's crazy.
Because there's no suspicion.
Yeah, of course not, yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Now, was the pool always there? Or was that kind of newer?
The pool is newer.
Oh, okay, okay.
The pool is newer. But obviously, the setup, I mean, they couldn't keep the same pool that they had.
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
Years and years ago.
I'm sure. So yes, we are in the scandal room here on Watergate. This is the room that they stayed in. And I'm going to flip you guys around. This is crazy.
Yeah, I did a tour with one.
So
There was our owners are
other people taking the tour too, so
in what they do, so they offer.
Nixon resigns. I'll show you over here
And
too.
so they invited
Plus stuff over
this
here.
little boy who was getting some work done at
So yep, this is the actual room.
to stay over the
DNC right over here.
Obviously, he listened to
So
music.
this is where they stood right out on this balcony with the like the microphones to be able to hear and listen in and do all that stuff. So
And so I
very
do
cool.
like a.
So they could have walked using this walkway, but very, very cool.
Okay.
So yeah, that's right over, and this is the room they stayed in. So it's
I
awesome.
send a letter to the room.
And
and
yes,
it's the little boy's the president.
there you go.
And President.
Nice guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ with deadhistory, and this big building behind me. Let me flip you guys around. So that is Cornell University. I think it's like New York Presbyterian Hospital. That's actually where Richard Nixon died. So this is the hospital that Nixon died in. Big building here. You see the emergency room. There we go. It's like 5:30 in the morning here in the city, so it's pretty early. But this is the hospital that Nixon died in, right here. Right here, all this right here. So pretty cool stuff. Just wanted to show you guys. I believe it was 1994 was the year when he died, I believe. And there you go. There's the hospital he died in here in New York City. Thanks, guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History. And if you look right here behind me, see that bear's nest? I'll flip you guys around. So this is actually the very exclusive private, you can kind of see it's kind of like a gated community. And this is actually where Nixon died. He lived in here. This is where the ambulance took him out of. It is a gated community, of course. I can't get in there, as you see. But it is a very, very, very exclusive neighborhood. You can kind of see, like, up there what these condominiums and townhouses look like. Very bougie. It's beautiful, though. It's basically, I think this is considered Park Ridge, New Jersey. You're very, very close to the New York border. So, but this is the Bear's Nest condominium complex up here. So I just wanted to show you guys that. So this is where Nixon lived. See a car going in there. And this is where the ambulance came and got him and brought him to the hospital in New York. So you kind of see some of the townhouses and such there. It's just very beautiful. So I wanted to show you guys this and take some pictures. But this is where Nixon lived. His last moments of actual, life outside of a hospital. So this is where he lived, at the Bear's Nest complex. Thank you. Hey guys, TJ here with Dead History, and I am actually in Wyckoff, New Jersey, and I'm about to show you the Vanderplatte Funeral Home, which actually, right there, that's where Richard Nixon's body, I'm going to turn you guys around, this is where Richard Nixon's body was taken, and where his body was prepared for his funeral. This is the Vanderplatte Funeral Home in Wyckoff, New Jersey. So there you go. Right in there is probably where the body was taken and it was prepared. Right here. Alright guys, thanks for stopping in, appreciate it. Hey guys, TJ here with Dead History, and that right behind me is actually a guardhouse. I'm gonna flip you guys around and explain. So, this is actually the Saddle River Museum in Saddle River, New Jersey, and this guardhouse here is actually a guardhouse that was outside of President Nixon and First Lady Pat Nixon's house. It was like a mansion in Saddle River. They lived there from 1981 to 1991. And this was the guardhouse that their guard would be in. Here, I'll read it to you. Here you go. For 10 years, from 1981 to 1991, this guardhouse stood at the entrance to 15 Charlton Drive, Saddle River, New Jersey, where President Richard M. Nixon resided. In 1991, the Nixon residence was sold to Iowa Ushijima of Japan. Colleen and Robert Heichman Jr. purchased the property in 2006 and donated the guardhouse to the Saddle River Museum. So, pretty cool stuff. There you go. The guardhouse that was outside of the mansion that President Nixon and First Lady Pat Nixon lived at. So there you go. Pretty old and beat up and just sits here, but pretty neat. Thanks, guys.